Tonight, we start with the forgotten rituals of the morning, the clink of pottery, the hiss of baking bread, and the soft crunch of barley underfoot. We're diving deep into the hazy golden light of ancient Egypt, where breakfast wasn't just a meal, it was an offering, a necessity, and in some cases, a survival strategy. So before we unroll the papyrus of history, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy drifting off to strange, delicious corners of the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Egypt? Kansas? Neptune? I see you all. Now dim the lights, fluff your pillow like a pharaoh's linen cushion, and maybe light some incense if you're feeling extra. Let's wander backward, through layers of sand and time, to find out what the ancient Egyptians ate for breakfast. But before we talk food, we need to talk about the land, because nothing shaped Egyptian breakfast more than the Nile. Imagine waking up in a narrow mud brick home along the banks of the Nile River, somewhere around 1500 BCE. The walls are cool and clay thick. Your roof is thatched with reeds, and outside, the water glints like a serpent made of gold. But it's not just pretty. It's life. Without the Nile, there is no breakfast. There is no Egypt. Each year, the river floods, politely but persistently, leaving behind a thick, dark silt so rich it could make a cactus blush. That fertile soil birthed Egypt's pantry. Wheat and barley, dates, onions, figs, a flood-fed grocery list that dictated what every man, woman, priest, and pyramid builder might find in their morning bowl. But don't get excited just yet. This was breakfast, ancient style. There were no croissants, no cinnamon toast crunch, and coffee? That wouldn't exist for another 3,000 years. Which is honestly a little tragic. But what they lacked in espresso, they made up for in invention. Let's start with the most sacred of ancient carbs, bread. Not soft, cloud-like sandwich bread. Think harder, denser, chewier. Bread in ancient Egypt was not a background food. It was the main event. The Egyptians practically invented the concept of a daily loaf. In fact, the word for life and the word for bread were often used interchangeably, which makes sense when you're surrounded by desert on all sides. Bread was life, literally. The most common type? A squat, round little thing made from emmer wheat, a grain that makes modern wheat look like a pampered house pet. Emmer is tough, unrefined. It requires soaking, grinding, and the strength of several people, or one very determined scribe, to turn into flour. But once you got there, you could make dozens of types of bread. Flatbreads, dome-shaped loaves, honey-sweetened cakes, even bread shaped like animals or gods for ritual offerings. And yes, sometimes that bread was flavored with things like dates, sesame seeds, or if you were wealthy, figs and nuts. For the average laborer or farmer, though, breakfast bread was functional. Not pretty, not soft, and definitely not gluten-free. Now picture this. The sun is barely peeking over the palm trees. You're sitting on a low stool outside your home. Maybe you're a field laborer, or maybe you help ferry boats up and down the Nile. Either way, you're tired, you're hungry, and in front of you is a chunk of yesterday's bread, reheated over a clay hearth. Beside it, a small bowl. Inside, beer. Yes, beer for breakfast. And no, we're not talking about Oktoberfest-style foam-topped lagers. Ancient Egyptian beer was different. Thick, murky, closer to liquid bread than modern brew. It was made by fermenting partially baked loaves in water, sometimes with added dates or herbs for flavor. The result? A pulpy, porridge-like drink full of calories, nutrients, and a light buzz. Breakfast of champions. or at least breakfast of farmers. Even children drank beer, not to get drunk, but because water wasn't always safe. The beer, mildly alcoholic and slightly sour, killed off nasty bacteria and provided sustenance all on its own. You didn't just drink it, you chewed it. Now, before we move on, a quick note on class, because not all breakfasts were created equal. If you were poor, and let's be real, most people were, you ate bread and beer, maybe with a few onions or leeks pulled from your garden. Maybe a handful of dates if the trees were generous that year. That was it, a utilitarian meal meant to fuel you through long days of hauling, harvesting, and hoping the next flood came on time. But if you were rich, if you were nobility, a priest, or one of the bureaucrats who sat under a canopy fanning themselves while others hauled bricks, then breakfast was different. You might begin your day with fresh-baked bread infused with honey, sweet cakes shaped like lotus blossoms, bowls of grapes, fresh figs or pomegranates split open like jewels. You'd sip beer too, of course, but it might be flavored with herbs like coriander or even saffron if you were especially fancy. Milk was rare, but it happened. Eggs? Sometimes, mostly from ducks or geese, since chickens hadn't arrived in Egypt yet. Yes, that's right. For thousands of years, breakfast existed without the mighty chicken. Tragic. And then there were the meats. Most Egyptians didn't eat meat daily. It was expensive, sacred, and reserved for festivals or temple offerings. But the elite? They had access to dried fish, roasted duck, even slabs of salted beef from temple herds. Not exactly bacon and eggs, but close. So what did it all look like? Picture a wide, low table carved from limestone, shaded by palm leaves, bowls filled with dates, plates stacked with bread, a clay jug of beer, cool and frothy from overnight fermentation. A servant pours. You dip your bread. The smell of onions wafts in from the kitchen hearth. In the distance, you can hear reed flutes. Someone is preparing to go pray. Someone else is about to record grain tallies on a scroll. The city is waking up. So are the gods. Because in ancient Egypt, breakfast wasn't just for people. It was for the divine. In ancient Egypt, even the gods had breakfast. Every morning, in temples scattered from the Nile Delta to the edge of Nubia, priests awoke before the sun. They didn't sleep in. Not when Ra, the sun god himself, was expected to rise on schedule and light the sky. The priests washed, shaved their heads, and donned fresh linen robes. Ritual cleanliness was non-negotiable. And then, with incense in one hand and offerings in the other, they began their morning service, to feed the gods. Yes, the gods ate first, not metaphorically, literally, or at least symbolically literal. Statues of deities like Amun, Hathor, and Thoth were awakened each day with chants and songs. Then they were offered the best food in the land: fresh bread, sweet beer, cuts of meat, honey, fruits, and cakes shaped like the eye of Horus. Not because the statues were hungry, but because feeding the gods kept the universe running. No pressure. Of course, after the ceremony, those offerings didn't go to waste. Priests and temple workers quietly divvied up the divine breakfast and tucked in themselves. Holy leftovers, if you will. Meanwhile, outside the temple walls, regular Egyptians were beginning their own mornings. Less sacred, perhaps, but no less vital, especially in the fields. You see, in ancient Egypt, the workday started early, really early, as in before the sun peeks over the papyrus early. Farmers didn't wait for the rooster, mostly because they didn't have one. Chickens wouldn't show up in Egypt until around 1500 BCE, and even then, they were luxury birds. Instead, people rose with the first hint of light, often after sleeping on flat rooftops to catch the cool desert breeze. Breakfast was fast,
Practical. Bread from the night before, soaked in beer or water to soften it. Maybe a few fresh figs if they were in season. Onion slices, a clove of garlic, a radish. Just enough to quiet your stomach before a day spent hauling irrigation buckets or plowing fields with wooden tools and oxen that looked just as tired as you did. No eggs, no sugar, and definitely no leisurely brunch. But if you were lucky, really lucky, you might have had something unexpected on your morning plate. A crocodile egg. Yes, crocodile. In some southern regions of Egypt, people collected eggs from riverbanks when they dared. It was dangerous. A game of breakfast roulette involving stealth, speed, and a strong disregard for personal safety. But protein was protein, and if you managed to snatch one without becoming part of the food chain yourself, you earned your meal. Still, for most, the staples remained humble. Bread, beer, and onions. Always onions. Egyptians loved onions. Not in a trendy, put-them-on-your-burger kind of way, but as sacred vegetables. They believed onions had magical properties. Their concentric rings symbolized eternal life. Pharaohs were buried with them. Priests used them in rituals. And everyone, from slaves to scribes, ate them daily. In fact, breakfast often smelled like onions, sharp, earthy, strong enough to wake the dead, or at least your neighbor. And while we're talking neighbors, let's talk about who you might be sharing breakfast with. Ancient Egyptian homes were small, cramped, and lively. A typical peasant house might be 1 or 2 rooms, with a flat roof used for sleeping, storing grain, or drying clothes. Families were big. Extended relatives often lived together. That meant breakfast was rarely a quiet, solitary experience. Children running around, grandparents giving unsolicited opinions, a goat in the corner, maybe a cat staring judgmentally at your bread. Cats, by the way, were everywhere. Domesticated not just for their charm, but for their skill at mouse hunting, cats were sacred animals, linked to Bastet, goddess of protection and home. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was a serious offense. But sharing your food with one? That was encouraged. So if a furry paw stole a bite of your fishy leftovers, you let it happen. Who were you to deny Bastet? Now, let's talk about fish. Specifically, dried or salted fish. While meat was expensive and rare, fish were accessible to most Egyptians. The Nile teemed with them. Tilapia, catfish, mullet. They were caught with nets woven from flax or cotton and then preserved for storage. Fish wasn't just a dinner item. In many regions, it made an appearance at breakfast, too. A small dried fish beside your barley bread and beer was perfectly normal. Think of it like their version of lox, without the bagel, or cream cheese, or refrigeration. And sometimes, if the stars aligned, or if you lived near a market, you might score a breakfast a notch above basic. There are records of cheese being made in ancient Egypt, often from cow or goat milk. Not creamy brie or cheddar. Think crumbly, salty curds wrapped in linen and aged in baskets. Tangy, firm, and very rustic, but it got the job done. Spread on bread, eaten with dates, or dropped into stews, this early cheese occasionally made its way to the breakfast table. Pair that with a handful of dried sycamore figs and a sip of warm beer, and you've got yourself an elite peasant feast. Now, a brief detour, because we need to address something important. Ancient Egyptian bread was not safe by modern standards. Archaeologists studying tombs and kitchens have found evidence that sand, grit, and even bits of rock often made their way into the flour during grinding. That meant eating bread wore down your teeth, literally. Over time, people's molars eroded to the gums. Imagine chewing concrete for 30 years, and you'll get the idea. It was breakfast with a side of dental disaster. That's why even wealthy Egyptians often suffered from terrible tooth decay. You could be a priest of Ra, chanting at sunrise with gold jewelry and fine linen, and still be gumming your bread by age 40. But teeth or no teeth, you still ate, because not eating meant not working, and not working meant no good. In a society where pharaohs ruled like gods, scribes tracked your grain allotments, and taxes came in the form of wheat, breakfast wasn't just fuel, it was survival. You worked to eat, and you ate to work. Even prisoners and slaves were fed some form of breakfast, usually barley gruel or the roughest bread, enough to keep them laboring in the sun. Because while the gods got honey cakes, the workers got crumbs. But even crumbs meant life. So you chewed through the grit, you drank your chunky beer, you thanked the gods you had something in your belly, and then you stepped out into the rising heat of another Egyptian day. The markets opened, boats drifted down the Nile, priests lit incense, and somewhere in the distance a child licked honey off her fingers and smiled. A rare treat on a dusty morning, because once in a while, if the harvest was good, if the gods were kind, you might just get honey on your bread.
If you were royalty in ancient Egypt, breakfast wasn't just food. It was an event, a small gilded ceremony before the day's divine obligations, treaties, and papyrus paperwork. You didn't wake up groggy, no. You were gently stirred by servants, perhaps to the sound of flutes or soft chanting. Someone opened the shutters to let in the golden Nile light. Someone else brought a bowl of scented water for your hands. Maybe a little dab of perfumed oil behind your ears, because it's hard to command the universe with bed-ed. And then came the tray. Carried in by silent feet across tiled floors, the royal breakfast tray was nothing short of an edible art piece. Fine bread sculpted into sacred shapes, ankhs, lotuses, miniature obelisks. Bowls of fresh honey, not from a squeeze bottle, but harvested painstakingly by hand from buzzing clay hives. Fruit sliced into delicate fans, dates, figs, grapes, pomegranate seeds scattered like edible rubies. And yes, beer, but not the thick, earthy brew of the farmers. Royal beer was filtered, strained, and perfumed with herbs. It was still closer to liquid oatmeal than Pilsner, but it came in elegant ceramic vessels painted with gold leaf and protected by cork stoppers wrapped in wax. Breakfast, but make it divine. Pharaohs and their families likely ate little first thing, just enough to wake the senses. A couple pieces of fruit, a sweet cake, a sip of something warm. After all, they were expected to appear poised, godlike, and ideally uncrumbed by the time they emerged onto the palace balconies. But behind that royal polish was a very human truth. They still got hungry, and breakfast, however fancy, still had to be eaten. Now, let's wander away from the palace, past the scribe schools and sun-drenched courtyards, toward the tombs. Yes, the tombs. Because some of the best evidence of ancient Egyptian breakfasts isn't in the kitchens, it's in the graves. You see, Egyptians believed in feeding the dead, literally. Tomb paintings, carved reliefs, and actual preserved food items offer us a strange, poetic glimpse into their mealtime priorities, especially first thing in the afterlife. In the tomb of Ti, a wealthy official during the 5th dynasty, breakfast offerings are carved into stone with loving precision. Baskets of bread, whole ducks, jars of beer, heaps of onions, fresh-cut leeks, and strange donut-shaped cakes whose recipes are lost to time. The afterlife apparently was just one long buffet table. Why? Because the dead still had appetites. Spirits needed sustenance to make their journey through the underworld. To neglect a loved one's tomb offering was to starve their soul, which means that for thousands of years, people woke up and made breakfast for the living, for the gods, and for their ancestors.
It wasn't uncommon to see someone leave a loaf of bread and a bit of beer outside a tomb, just in case great-uncle Nebset still got peckish around sunrise. But it wasn't always so serious. Some of Egypt's breakfasts were downright indulgent, like tiger nut cake. Yes, tiger nuts. Despite the name, they are not nuts and have nothing to do with tigers. They're small, wrinkly tubers, like earthy almonds dug up from the banks of the Nile. High in fat and sweetness, they were mashed and mixed with honey, dates, or flour, then shaped into cakes or balls. The texture? Somewhere between a granola bar and a cookie made from sand. But the flavor? Sweet, nutty, dense. Basically the closest thing to a breakfast pastry an Egyptian peasant could get. Archaeologists have found traces of these cakes inside tombs, suggesting they weren't just snacks, but sacred snacks, the kind of thing you'd want to carry into the next world. And they weren't the only treats. In some regions, people flavored their bread with coriander, cumin, or fenugreek. Others experimented with sycamore fig jam, sesame pastes, or even wild honey mixed with crushed dates. Think of it as proto-Nutella, but with more fiber and fewer spoons. Did people enjoy breakfast in ancient Egypt? Well, enjoyment wasn't the point. Food was fuel, but yes, there are signs that people found joy in it, especially when they had something rare, something seasonal, a fresh melon, a handful of carob pods, a bird egg not stolen from a crocodile. When you live in a place where drought is always 2 bad harvests away, every bite is a small celebration. And yet, not everyone celebrated. There were strict fasters. Priests, especially during times of ritual purification, often abstained from food until midday. They believed that eating early polluted the body before it was fit to commune with the gods. So their mornings were spent in silence, incense smoke curling around their empty stomachs as they offered food they themselves wouldn't touch. Meanwhile, slaves working the temple kitchens baked sacred loaves, shaped by hand and marked with small thumbprints. They didn't eat them either, at least not first. It's a strange irony. In a society that obsessed over feeding the gods, many of its people ate last. And yet, even among the lowest castes, food was shared. Imagine a worker returning from dawn chores. He's watered the garden, swept the courtyard, and refilled the water jugs. He sits under a low canopy with 2 or 3 others. They pass around a clay bowl filled with barley porridge. It's simple. It's hot. It's everything. Someone slices an onion. Someone else brings out a small dried fish. A baby cries. A dog licks something suspicious off the floor. This is not a scene fit for a tomb painting, but it is real. And in that moment, bitter porridge, rough bread, and all, it matters. Because breakfast in ancient Egypt wasn't just a personal ritual. It was social glue. You shared what you had. You swapped gossip with your neighbor over figs. You nodded good morning to the scribe chewing his date cake. And maybe, just maybe, you spared a sip of beer for the cat rubbing against your ankle. Of course, not every meal was peaceful. There were arguments over missing bread, fights over stolen onions, children who refused to eat unless the bread had honey on it. You think food battles are a modern thing? Please. Ancient Egyptian parents were bribing their kids with dates long before anyone invented chocolate milk. Still, food held the day together. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over limestone walls and reed baskets, breakfast ended. People folded their linen shawls, wiped their hands on clay pots, and went back to their daily lives, scribing, farming, weaving, rowing, praying. But always the memory of that morning meal lingered. The feel of warm bread, the tang of fermented beer, the sweetness of a honey-dipped fig, the kind of things you didn't always have. But when you did, you remembered. Because in a land obsessed with eternity, even the smallest bites mattered.
By now, we've wandered through kitchens and temples, from farmers' porridge to pharaohs' honeyed cakes. But breakfast in ancient Egypt wasn't one size fits all. Just as the Nile split the country into upper and lower regions, so too did geography shape what ended up in your morning bowl. Let's take a slow drift down the river and look at some regional differences. In Upper Egypt, further south, where the Nile runs narrow between rocky cliffs, you'd find tougher living conditions. The land was less generous, the soil less consistent, but the people, resourceful. Here, breakfast leaned harder on what could be foraged: wild herbs, sycamore figs, chickpeas, and river fish dried in the hot sun. Dates were a treasure, used sparingly in stews and breads. Beer was heavier, darker. The bread, often made with whatever grain survived the floods: millet, barley, sometimes even crushed legumes. In Lower Egypt, near the Delta, it was a different story. Rich silt made the farmland bountiful, the diet softer. Bread was more refined, fruits more plentiful. You could stroll through markets with baskets brimming with onions, cucumbers, lentils, and sweet grapes. The breakfasts here were, dare we say, luxurious, at least by ancient standards. Still simple, but with more flair. And in cities like Memphis, Egypt's old capital, food had flair and ritual. Here, breakfast wasn't just fuel, it was identity. The priest class, artisans, bureaucrats, they weren't breaking their fast alone. Meals were communal, tied to hierarchies. A scribe might eat better than a carpenter. A temple musician might dine on seasoned lentils, while the baker next door made do with burned crusts. Social standing showed up on the plate. But no matter where you were, one thing united everyone. Food was sacred. Not in the romantic, Instagrammable way we think about brunch today, but sacred in the old sense. Eating was communion, not just with others, but with the divine forces believed to animate the world. The sun god Ra journeyed through the sky each day, only to battle the serpent of chaos, Apophis, every night. When Ra rose again in the morning, Egyptians believed it was a victory of cosmic proportions. And what better way to celebrate victory than with breakfast? To eat bread at dawn was to join the gods in their renewal. To sip beer as the sun climbed was to participate in the very rhythm of the universe. And the gods didn't just accept food, they required it. Temple rituals, especially in the morning, were elaborate food shows. The statues were washed, perfumed, dressed, and then fed. Carefully arranged platters, fresh flatbreads, cakes shaped like birds, baskets of figs, bowls of spiced beer. Each item placed with intention. Not to be eaten by the statue, of course, but to symbolically maintain ma'at, the sacred balance of the cosmos. Breakfast was an act of order. Repeating it daily was how you kept chaos at bay. Even tombs echoed this belief. Inscriptions weren't just decorative, they listed food offerings in careful inventory. 100 loaves of bread, 100 jugs of beer, 10 baskets of onions, 5 of dates, 2 roasted ducks, 1 calf, 1 sweet cake shaped like the moon. Not because anyone thought those items would magically appear, but because saying the words, carving them into eternity, was believed to create them in the afterlife. Breakfast, as it turns out, was immortal. But there's more. Let's talk about superstitions. Because Egyptians, for all their engineering brilliance, were deeply mystical. You didn't just eat anything at any time. Certain foods were linked to omens. For example, garlic, widely eaten during breakfast, was thought to ward off evil spirits and disease. It wasn't just for flavor, it was armor. Leeks were consumed not just for taste, but because they opened the voice, helpful if you were a priest or public speaker. Fish, especially in temple towns, could be taboo. Some sects avoided them entirely, believing certain fish were sacred or off-limits on ritual days. Honey, rare and precious, was sometimes mixed with medicinal herbs and consumed at dawn to promote long life, virility, or fertility, depending on which god you wanted to impress. These weren't just habits, they were spells. Breakfast as magic. And magic wasn't just for the high-born. Even the poorest Egyptian woman grinding grain before sunrise might mutter a blessing over her dough, not because she was superstitious, but because she had to. When grain rot, pestilence, or drought could kill you, invoking divine help over breakfast wasn't superstition, it was survival strategy. And speaking of survival, let's address one of the more unpleasant realities: food scarcity. Not every day brought breakfast. The Nile didn't always flood on schedule. Crops failed. Grain stores were looted. Markets closed. And sometimes, well, people went hungry. Letters from ordinary Egyptians etched into shards of pottery tell of bread shortages and beer rations. One man writes to a local official begging for 2 measures of grain for my children cry at dawn. Another complains that he has worked a full week and received only stale loaves and beer that tastes of mud. Breakfast in these cases became a weapon, a tool of control. The state fed you if you served it, and if you didn't, well, you fasted. Or more accurately, you starved. The pharaoh may have been a living god, but his subjects were mortal. Their bodies needed calories, and if those calories didn't arrive, their bones told the story. Anthropologists today can trace food insecurity through malnutrition in skeletal remains. Tiny bodies, stunted growth, worn teeth. Life was not always kind. But still, they made bread. Even in hardship, even when the Nile betrayed them, people baked. They ground what little they had, added water, maybe salt, and shaped rough dough with trembling hands. Sometimes they shaped loaves into little crocodiles or birds, asking nature to be kind. Other times they shaped them into flat discs, scored with crosses, a pattern some say was a prayer, others say was just a tally mark, and still others claim was just practical, easier to tear and share. And they shared, because despite everything, breakfast remained communal. The act of gathering around food, even when there was barely any, was part of what it meant to be human, to be Egyptian, to be alive. In the villages, people didn't eat alone. Even in hunger, someone always offered a bite, a crust, a sip, especially in the mornings when the air was still soft and the heat hadn't yet arrived to press down like judgment. Because in ancient Egypt, the day began not with silence, but with the sound of chewing, and maybe a little gossip. And yes, maybe someone complaining that the beer was too sour. Again.
It's easy to think of ancient Egypt as frozen in time, as hieroglyphs and pyramids, as mummies sealed behind glass. But Egypt was alive, and if there's one thing that proves it, it's breakfast. Because what you eat when you wake up says everything. It tells you who has power, who is hungry, what is sacred, what is feared, and what is remembered. Let's zoom out. Egyptians didn't just eat. They encoded their meals into mythology. Take Isis and Osiris, one of Egypt's most powerful divine couples. After Osiris is murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis gathers the scattered pieces, brings him back to life, and conceives Horus, their divine son. And after that, Osiris becomes the god of the underworld. What's interesting isn't just the myth, it's what the dead are offered in his name. Every morning, tombs were supplied with the same staples: bread, beer, onions, and sometimes fish or meat. The same foods Osiris was believed to bless. These weren't random choices, they were spiritual breakfast baskets, fuel for the next world. In fact, the very act of eating came to symbolize resurrection. Every bite was a nod to the divine cycle: hunger, nourishment, strength, death, rebirth. You can see it in funerary texts like the pyramid texts and coffin texts, long spells and invocations etched inside tombs. Many of them read like prayers for meals. May you have bread in abundance. May your beer never sour. May your house be filled with onions. And may your ka never go hungry. This wasn't poetry.
It was insurance, a divine breakfast buffet written in stone. But breakfast wasn't only for the dead. It shaped daily life for the living, too. Egyptian workers, especially those building royal tombs and temples, were paid in rations. These rations, meticulously recorded on papyri, often included daily bread and beer, which meant breakfast wasn't just the first meal. It was your wage. Imagine clocking in at sunrise, carving limestone or hauling mud bricks under a punishing sun. Also, you could afford your barley porridge and pint of chunky morning beer. Productivity with carbs. Even the language reflects this. The ancient word for bread, tea, was also used in names, rituals, and offerings. The word for beer, henket, shows up constantly in temple inscriptions. Together, they were shorthand for life itself. It's a theme we see across Egyptian culture, this holy pairing of bread and beer. They were the sun and moon of the Egyptian table, the inhale and exhale of the agricultural cycle. And they still are. Travel through rural Egypt today and you'll find echoes of these ancient breakfasts still being served, often in silence, just as they were 4,000 years ago. Women in small villages wake before dawn. They knead dough by hand, slap it onto clay griddles heated with palm husks, and serve it with honey, or lentils, or pickled vegetables. They brew strong tea now instead of beer, but the pattern is familiar. The rhythm, the reverence, it's all still there. In homes across Luxor, Aswan, and rural Saqqara, bread is still sacred. It's not to be wasted. If it falls to the ground, it's kissed and placed back on the table. This too is old. Older than Islam, older than Rome. A practice born in mud brick kitchens beside the Nile. And that should tell us something. The Egyptians built monuments to the afterlife. But breakfast? That was for this life. It was the sigh of waking, the promise of work, the moment of connection, when you passed the bread, the onion, the beer, and remembered that you were still alive. That today, at least, you had food. Not much, maybe, but enough. So what can we learn from it? Maybe it's this, that there is power in ritual, that even small, gritty, beer-soaked moments can shape empires, that the bread you chew with cracked teeth still matters, and that what you feed yourself first thing in the morning feeds more than your body. It feeds your place in the world. The Egyptians knew this, which is why they didn't just eat breakfast, they recorded it, painted it, offered it to the gods, carved it into tombs, carried it into the next life. We don't know their names. Not most of them. Not the women who stirred barley over low fires. Not the children who crushed garlic in stone mortars. Not the men who delivered clay jugs of beer to market before sunrise. But we know what they ate. And in knowing that, we remember them. So if you're still awake, listening in the dark, eyelids heavy, you might think of them now. A young girl eating date cake beside a field. A grandmother pouring warm beer into a chipped bowl. A priest whispering blessings over bread he'll never taste. All of them long gone. And yet, somehow, still having breakfast. And you're part of it now. You've dipped into a world where food was myth, where hunger met holiness, where even the gods wanted a bite of warm bread at dawn. So tomorrow, when you wake up and grab your toast or cereal or double-shot espresso, maybe pause for a second. Say a quiet thank you to the Nile, to the emmer wheat, to the cats who stole fish, to the bakers who ground their teeth to dust, to the scribes who wrote down beer rations with aching hands, to the people who made sure breakfast existed at all. Because history isn't built from wars and kings alone. Sometimes it's built from bread crusts, from fig seeds in a clay bowl, from the soft, forgotten echo of someone chewing in the early light. And that's enough. Now close your eyes, sleep well, and may your beer never sour.